All right, so on page 61, we'll start there for just a moment. On page 61 is an introduction to Anne Bradstreet. She is a Puritan poet, and she is very often considered the first Puritan poet. So Puritan poets are kind of a difficult subject because, well, any literature at that point is difficult because so much of the literature was very much whatever they had when they came from where they came from, whether that was England or the Netherlands. The Puritans came from many places, fleeing persecution. So they brought with them the kind of literature that they wrote. And so when you're trying to say, well, what was early American literature like? Well, it was very much like wherever they were coming from. So there's not too much distinct, but Anne Bradstreet is considered one of the first Puritan poets, so an early American poet. So she was born to rich parents in England, Anne Dudley, and her name was Anne Dudley. Dudley was her maiden name, and she didn't receive any formal schooling, but she was thoroughly educated at home. When she was 16, she was converted to Protestantism, and she became a Puritan. And she also got married that same year and was then known as Anne Bradstreet because she married Simon Bradstreet. So 2 years later, when she was 18, she reluctantly sailed to New England, to the New World, with her husband. In 1650, without her knowledge, a collection of her poems was published in London. I'm just kind of skimming through this. You should read it on your own, but I'm pulling out some highlights. So she had been writing some poetry, but somebody had taken her collection of poetry and published it in London without her knowing even, under the very extravagant title called The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America. And the Reverend John Woodbridge, her brother-in-law, was evidently the instigator. So her brother-in-law took her poetry and said, "This is really good. I'm going to publish it," without her knowing, because he didn't think she would want it published because she's a woman. So although such prominent New Englanders as Nathaniel Ward and Cotton Mather praised the book of poetry, it also excited some negative comments, like those in charge said that the poetess should spend her time with a needle rather than a pen. In other words, it's not a place for a woman to be writing poetry. And isn't that ironic? Because now today, most people who like poetry are more often than not going to be girls than boys. And back then they were saying that the woman should be managing the home and sewing something more than writing something, like she's wasting time or shirking her responsibilities or something. Among the more appealing of her public poems, one of the ones that the more people liked was the author to her book, which is what we're going to read, and Contemplations, which is what we read yesterday. Okay, she wrote some other things, and so you need to read the rest of her biography to make sure you know that, because that information will be on the quiz. But let's move on to the next page. So we're going to be reading the author to her book, but first I want to talk a little bit about some what you can call tools. So things that people use to write poetry. What's that? That's fine. Just it's not the poem yet, so you can still just take notes on what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is from 62. So when it's loading, then you guys can read along later. So there are three things that we're going to talk about. Analyzing. So when we read poetry, we want to analyze it, and you're going to look for what we're calling figurative language. Figurative language is artful deviations from literal speech or normal word order. So in other words, it's using things that are not meant literally, or it's changing the word order around so that it's artful, it's aesthetic, it's poetic. That's figurative language. And there's many ways that you can create figurative language, but 4 examples that we're going to talk about are metaphor, simile, personification, and apostrophe. And apostrophe is not the punctuation apostrophe. So what is metaphor? Metaphor is an imaginative comparison of two dissimilar things, which can be implied or stated, brief or extended. So basically, it is a comparison, an imaginative comparison, of two things that are not alike. So it's trying to say that one thing is like another thing, but it's not using the word like or as, because, as the next one is, a simile. A simile signals a comparison using like or as. So, an imaginative comparison comparing two things that are not alike. That's like saying the whiteboard is like a computer screen. But again, it's not using the word like. So, but it's comparing two things that are not alike by drawing out something and making a comparison. That's a metaphor. And then a simile is drawing a comparison using like or as. Personification is giving human characteristics to non-human objects or entities. So when it says that we should be living before the face of God, or when God stretched out his hand and cursed the people with disease, God the Father is a spirit. He doesn't have a hand, and that would be personification, giving human characteristics to a non-human object or entity. And then the last one is apostrophe. These are three types of figurative language: metaphor, simile, personification, and apostrophe. Apostrophe is when you are writing or saying an address to an absent person or an abstraction or an object. So it makes an abstraction personal. So for example, you can write a letter to the president. Now I don't know if he'll actually get it, but you can write one and send it to him. And write it to him and write it for him so that when he reads it, he knows he's reading it for himself, right? But you could also write a letter to the president and post it online. And it's not meant to be sent to the president, but it's as if you were saying it to the president. Do you understand the difference? That's the difference between writing something for someone and writing an apostrophe. So if I'm writing something and it's to an idea, I could be... Maybe I wanted to personify that bookshelf as a person. Like in Beauty and the Beast, the closet is that opera singing lady, right? I could personify something like a bookshelf, and then I could write a letter of thankfulness to my bookshelf for how thankful I am that he, the bookshelf, supports all my literature and blah, blah, blah. That letter would be an apostrophe. That letter would be an apostrophe because I'm writing it to somebody or an abstraction or an idea. That's what makes an apostrophe an apostrophe. So let's turn to the author to her book. You guys can, if it's not loaded, then just look it up online. Just look up Anne Bradstreet, the author to her book. Macy, do you have it, or is it not loaded?
Yeah, it's loaded.
It loaded. Oh, good. So this will be on page 63. Chloe, were you able to find it?
Oh, yeah, it's in here.
Okay. Macy, do you have it yet? All right, great. So let's read along. This is titled The Author to Her Book. So like we said, her brother-in-law had had published her poetry for her without her knowing. And so what she's doing is writing a letter as a poem to her book, which is an apostrophe, right? So we said apostrophe was when you write something to something or someone as if you were writing it to them. So she's writing this poetry as if it's to her book, and her book is she's personifying it as if it's a child, as if it's her child. And listen for what she says that is talking about her brother-in-law publishing her poetry without her knowledge and how she feels about it, because that's what this is about. So read along with me. The author to her book. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting tooth-press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat, in print, should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for sight. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet, being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot, still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runst more hobbling than is meet. And better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array, mongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out the door. All right, this is a really creative approach to addressing why she didn't want to publish her poetry. So tell me, after reading this, what is her opinion of her own poetry? Knowing that she's writing this to her child, as if her poetry was a child, so she's writing this to her poetry, what is her opinion of this, of her poetry? And then when you give me your opinion, tell me where you're getting that from in the poem. What are some things that you see in the poem that refer to her opinion of her poetry?
It's a ill-formed offspring from her brain.
Okay, good. So the very first line right away is an ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain. And what does that mean, may I say?
That she's writing what she thinks, that's why it's ill.
She what?
She's writing what's on her head, or like what she's thinking.
Yeah, so what she wrote came from her own mind. But what does it mean to say that what she wrote is her ill-formed offspring? And why is she calling her brain feeble?
She's a woman?
Okay.
Or is that like what she's been told her entire life because women didn't really do that sort of thing?
Yeah, so it wasn't very common for women to be the ones writing poetry. And I think she could be referring to the fact that she's a woman. So if you look at the definition of feeble at the bottom, there's a footnote. It says feeble, lacking vigor or effectiveness, inadequate. So very simply, she's saying, I'm not the smartest person in the room, right? So I'm not going to be the one that can write the best poetry, so why would I publish it, right? But then it also adds here that the birth metaphor additionally conveys a lack of bodily strength, weakness. And feeble definitely can refer to bodily strength. So as a woman, she's the one that would bear a child and give birth. And she's saying that this poem is the product of her mind, the child of her brain, the offspring. And so maybe she's saying that just like a woman who's pregnant but is weak, is not healthy, is not going to have a good, the best of pregnancies and birth experiences, that her poetry is also the result of not the greatest, smartest brain. So I don't think it's necessarily referring to her like the fact or because she's a woman, but the fact that gender is there is just, is still a fact. Good. So what else? What else do we see in the poem that refers to her opinion of her poetry? Do you see the part where she talks about how her brother-in-law took the poetry and published it without her knowledge? So it's in the third line. It says, the second line, who after birth did by my side remain. So after she wrote this poetry, then she kept it, right, by my side. Then she says, and she kept it by her side until it was snatched away by her friends who were less wise than true. What does that mean to say that her friends were less wise than true? What does that mean? Okay, so I think it's a really creative way of saying it. She's saying they are less wise than they are true. In other words, they are true, but they weren't very wise. So they were being true friends. They cared about her. They weren't trying to take credit for her poetry, right? Like somebody nowadays who takes poetry somebody wrote and then published it might be trying to steal it and then take the royalties or something. They were doing it in her name for her because they knew that it was good. So they were being true friends, but she feels like that wasn't the wisest thing to do. But she definitely has a gracious attitude towards them. She's not bitter about it, right? And then it goes on, who thee abroad exposed to public view. So they took you, my child, the offspring of my brain, my poetry, and they exposed you to public view, and they made you in rags, halting to the press to trudge. So stumbling, right? Halting to the press. And then it mentions this thing about feet. It says, halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. So nothing was fixed. It wasn't, edited and proofread. My rambling brat, it was not an obedient child. It wasn't as a metaphor, the poetry wasn't an obedient child. Her blushing was not small. And then she says, down in line 15, when she got him back, I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet. So it had said that the child was trudging, hobbling to the press. What is it referring to when she mentions feet? I stretched thy joints to make you even feet. Do you remember the last lesson about feet? What are feet? What did I say feet were? Look at the footnote. It says it there. Feet, number 3. This is a pun, like a joke, on units of poetic meter consisting of the regular recurrence of stressed and unstressed syllables. So we said feet were the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. But she's saying that the patterns weren't really all that good. Sometimes they were uneven and they weren't well organized, right? Her feet were hobbling. And so she's drawing a metaphor. And in that case, aside from the whole poem being personification, she's saying that the child, she's personifying her poem, the feet, poetic feet, as feet of a child. And that's exactly what personification is, giving human characteristics to non-human objects or entities. So she's really using a lot of different figurative language in this poem she's using personification of the whole poem. She's using metaphor, and she's using apostrophe. Is there any simile in this? Do you guys see any simile? I'm not sure if there is. I don't remember. I didn't see any. All right. So that is the author to her book. It's a very creative way of addressing what her opinion was of her brother-in-law publishing her poetry without her knowledge. Do you guys like the poem?